Hello and welcome, I'm Kira Scrivener, and today I'm going to have a chatty video talking about all the books I need to finish by the end of the year and the ones that I have given up on, or probably should give up on, because I always have great desires to read lots of books, but I am a little bit of a scattered reader. I pick up one book, I set it down, I pick up another book. It's how I happen to read a lot of books, and I enjoy it because I really like books and I like a variety of books, and I don't want to punish myself by persevering through books I'm not enjoying. However, there's some books I would like to finish and haven't. The first book I'm going to talk about is Great Expectations, and this is a book that I started during October and had every intention of finishing in the month of October. Did I? I did not. And it's very interesting because I started this book for the first time probably when I was 15 and never finished it. However, I always had this interpretation that it is about Pip and that early in the novel he discovers that he's a gentleman and he has to go off and be a gentleman. And that is definitely not the plot of this novel. It is instead much more he's a young boy who was orphaned at birth, I think, and his sister has raised him very ungratefully, does not love him very much, but he loves his brother-in-law. And then when he's about 10 or so, a lady who is a recluse who no one has seen in years and years and years asks him to go and play in front of him. And then after a few months of this, she goes, okay, you're old enough, go off and be an apprentice. And that is where I am, which is very early on. But he has now had a distaste for his own upbringing. He feels like he is deficient, and he also feels like his best friend, his brother-in-law, is also deficient. And yeah, I don't know what it's going to say about class. I feel like he might still be secretly noble somehow, or like a gentleman or something like that, but I don't know. It is a novel that I want to read, and yet I keep on finding myself pushing it off, so I definitely need to get onto that momentum of reading it. A book that I'm having quite the opposite issue with is North and South. And this is a book that I read last year, finally, and I really, really loved it. It was such an enjoyable book. If you're not familiar with it, it is often compared to Pride and Prejudice, set in the 1850s with mills and socialism kind of going on in the background. There's a lot of things different, but some of the dynamics definitely mirror some of the dynamics in Pride and Prejudice. And I love it so much. I read it last year, and this year I gathered a few of my friends in real life that love classics, and I said, can we read this book? Can we have a classic book club in general where, we read a quarter of a book and then, we discuss it, and I made wonderful questions and themes and asked them questions, which was really fun for me. Next time I'm hoping to read a book that I haven't read yet, but this was really fun, just making them all read it. I'm not going to be able to finish this book until late January, and it's already killing me because I just want to reread it all because it is such a lovely book. So this is a book that I'm not going to be finishing by the end of the year, but not because I'm not interested in it. And then talking about Pride and Prejudice, I have been reading Pride and Prejudice, in fact. So back in September, I turned 27, and when you turn 27 years old, you have to have a Charlotte Lucas birthday. And mine was really beautiful. My friend Hannah made me a cake, and it had the quote on it. And during that night, one of my friends was talking about her love of the 1990 series and was like, you need to come over when it's Christmas time and we'll watch it. So, the Christmas lights are up, it's November, and we watched it about 2 weeks ago, and it was so delightful. I did not grow up with watching it all. I grew up with watching the 2005 movie, and when I did watch it a few years ago, I was disappointed. Some of the choices, especially around Collins and other things, I was just like, no. He's not in his 40s, and he is a lot of things, but he's not a creepy old man looking at these girls. There's just other choices that were made, and I was like, no. So yes, there was elements, but this time I watched it and I felt so enamored with warmth and coziness. And after that night I came home and I kept on thinking about Pride and Prejudice over and over again, and I was like, okay, I need to pick it up. So about last week I picked it up, and I've been reading it at nighttime before I go to bed, and it's been really lovely. I've always had a hard time reading Jane Austen's books because she's one of my favorite authors. I have taken in more content about her maybe than any other author, and I love looking into her books and reading them, and I have such intimate relationships with so many of her books. Pride and Prejudice has always been a peculiar case for me because I was introduced to it first as a movie and then as the wonderful, wonderful YouTube series, The Lizzie Bennet Diaries, which I probably watched 4 or 5 times before I read the book. And similarly, I watched the 2005 movie so many times. So it's the only one that the adaptation kind of came first. And I had such strong feelings about it, and I knew the plot points down to every little thing. So reading the book was never as fulfilling as reading Emma or Persuasion or Northanger Abbey, because I just have so much joy while reading those books. And I'm like, but I love Pride and Prejudice, and I love Darcy, and I love Elizabeth, and I love so many of these characters, but also I don't have the novelness that I have with other books, because all of the other books I read for the first time as an adult and have that really strong relation to it. But this time I'm feeling like I'm greedily reading Pride and Prejudice for the first time. I'm feeling taken in by it and just wanting to go through step by step and enjoy it. And I think that this may lead me to actually eventually do my Jane Austen reading video that I wanted to do for so long, but I'm like, I don't know where to put Pride and Prejudice on that because I have such complicated feelings in general because, again, she's one of my favorite authors. I love her work so much. Mansfield Park is also just so good. Sense and Sensibility is the last book that I read by her, but I also really like it. It's also making me wonder if for Christmas I should spoil myself and get BritBox for like a month and watch a bunch of the adaptations because I've never been an adaptation person. And so often if I love the adaptation, I never read the book. And if I love the book, I never watch the adaptation. And there are adaptations like Emma 2020 that are universally loved that I hate because Emma doesn't feel right to me. And I don't universally hate adaptations. I watched the 2009 adaptation right after watching Emma 2020 and I like it a lot because that Emma feels better to me. But I do think that there's adaptations that I can give another shot to. I also really want to watch the 2008 Sense and Sensibility. I started it when I first read the book 2 years ago, but I haven't gone back and finished it. I've never watched an adaptation for Northanger Abbey, and I only hate watched Persuasion in 2022. And I might rewatch that one too. I might give it a shot, you know, as something separate, because I know that it's not probably a terrible movie, but to me, who loves Persuasion so much, it felt terrible. Normally my Jane Austen love goes from March until August, and I always know it's spring when I want to pick up a Jane Austen book, but this year, I guess we're having a renaissance in November, and that's also really sweet, keep me over the winter. The next book I'm going to talk about is a book that I have said goodbye to, and I don't think I'm going to pick back up, and this is There's Always Next Year on Ascension and Basketball. And this is a book that I was super drawn to because the idea is that this author is going to tell the story of basketball and how it impacted Ohio in the 1990s. I love the exploration of history and how different things intersect with each other. However, I know nothing about basketball. I grew up watching hockey and playing soccer, and my only experience with basketball is the fact that my family had a basketball net, and as the youngest child by many years, I often sat there and took a basketball and was very good at throwing shots, and this became very useful when I worked as a youth worker, because there's no game that is better to play with children than bump when you do a basketball, and I cannot throw a basketball or hit a hoop when I'm moving or doing anything. I don't know how to play basketball, but I can stand at the line and shoot a basketball in because I practiced a lot in my lonely childhood. But I know nothing about the culture of basketball. I know nothing about the rules of basketball. I don't really know the athletes of basketball. This book is partly about LeBron James, but if you told me LeBron James was a football player, I'd probably believe you. Like, I just don't have a lot of knowledge about it because basketball isn't a big sport in Canada and it's not something that I was interested in. I haven't even had the cultural osmosis that most Americans have on the understanding of basketball. It's just not a thing here. So yeah, I was just like, I don't know. It's very personal, which I would normally love, and it's very poetic, which I would normally love. But because it's more a personal exploration of these events rather than a groundwork of what events are going on, I'm just confused because I don't know anything about this era. And also, I normally like poetry, but for some reason it doesn't work. Sometimes there's just a missing link in that untangible thread that links a reader to an author, where you're just reading a work and you're loving it. And sometimes you don't know exactly why you're not getting into a book and you can't really help it. And I was so interested in this book and I was like, I am so confused, and that is making me lost, and that is making me just frustrated reading this book because I'm like, I want to know what's going on and I don't. I'm still really interested in this author and reading his work because he often looks at the Black perspective and how it interacts with different phenomenon in America, and that's really interesting. He has one book that's called A Little Devil in America that looks at Black performance and art and things like that, which I'm like, yes. I definitely have a better understanding of Black art and music than I do of basketball, so I think the barriers to entry will be way lower on that, so I can enjoy his work and not feel confused. The next book I don't think I'm going to finish, and I'm really sad about this one because I have read over 100 pages of it and enjoyed it a lot, and yet it is a really long book. It is 500 pages, and I was reading on ebook. There's no audiobook available. I can't even buy an audiobook. There's none available in North America, and I don't know what's happening there, but this book would be so beautiful, and I would rate it so highly, but reading on ebook when also you can't necessarily keep it for a long period of time because libraries, it's just a lot. This book is called My Friends, and it is about a group of Libyan friends, and they first meet at about 18 when they are students in the UK, and they go to protests, and they're young and hopeful, and they have all of these thoughts, and then it's about 30 years later, and they're reflecting on it, and he's thinking about all the regrets and the history of what's unsaid, and the fear of traveling over water, and so many things, and I love it so much. Like, I still think about some of these lines, even though it's been a few months since I've been reading this, and yet, do I think I'm going to read 400 pages before the end of the year? Probably not. I am a very slow reader. I have dyslexia, and I tend to read about maybe 15 to 20 pages per hour, which I know is very slow. So I'm like, well, this will probably be about 20 hours of reading left on an ebook. Will I do that? Probably not. Two other books that I picked up in the summer that I won't be finishing are Wild Houses, which I picked up as the Booker long list, and then also Mrs. March, which is a really interesting book about this woman who's dealing with jealousy and all of these feelings. I liked the idea of them, but reading them were very harsh. Wild Houses has a lot to do with like drugs and just other things that are just kind of dark and hard, and Mrs. March is just steeped with jealousy, and I like reading books about hard issues. It's hard for me when there's like a more cynical, like I don't even know, it's intangible the way that someone writes. My schooling's in counseling, and I've walked through a lot of really hard and difficult situations with people. And there's a way that people write about things that feel very much like tragic porn that I don't like. I don't like being in that like suffocating headspace. And yet I do like reading about these topics. I like when there's a glimmer of hope, when there's a glimmer of feeling in it that's not just grit and dirt. And that's just my perspective, and I know that it's not necessarily correct. Like, there is value in reading books that are about hard issues that are just kind of an underbelly of these books, but it's just not my style. I kind of feel like I encounter enough of people's hardships in real life and trying to hold on to hope and give hope in hard situations that I don't need to read about hopeless situations in books that there is no hope, because I do believe that in most situations there can be a glimmer of hope. There can be a glimmer of redemption. There can, even when systems suck, even when situations suck, even when things are abusive or bad or hard, that doesn't mean that this is the end of the story. And I think that's really important for me as a person who often encounters difficult situations. I don't like reading things that are just mired in cynicism, because the only way to get through hard things is to believe that once you go through this tunnel, even though it might be really long, it might be really hard, that it will be worth it. I'm not very squirmish when it comes to reading books, but I do find that the way people write about books really impacts whether I enjoy them or not, or if I just find myself getting depressed while reading it. And I don't necessarily want to be reading books that affect me negatively outside of it. And I did find that both of these books made me sadder in real life. The next book I'm going to talk about is a book that I don't think I would have picked up under normal circumstances, or at least to read. I definitely picked it up in order to buy it because I like Canadian classics and I like finding obscure things, and I'm very interested in Canadian literature, and there's not a lot of widely published books that came out in the 1940s in Canada. And this book did, and this is called The Master of the Mill, and I was just in a thrift store when I found it for like a few dollars, and I picked it up, and then I was driving my friend to an appointment, and I was sitting in my car for an hour or so, and I don't have data, so whenever I'm in a car is often when I do some reading, and this was one of the books that I had in my car, and I was like, well, I'll start it. And the introduction is a little savage, so whoever this editor is, like the guy who wrote the introduction, is just writing about how, Grove is a great author, but this book kind of sucks. He experimented with form and he wanted to be innovative in it, and it just didn't pay off. His other books that were earlier were much better. And, I don't know much about Grove. I googled him after and found that he ran away and, had a secret identity and married 2 wives, and he was a very scandalous man. But during this time, he was living in Toronto, I think. He had spent some time in Manitoba, and this book takes place in Manitoba, and I don't know if I read a book that takes place in Manitoba. It is a small province now and even smaller then, and definitely doesn't get a lot of representation in literature. So this was really cool to read. So I don't know a lot about Grove, and I don't know a lot about his former novels, but I do disagree with the editor because so far it's working for me. I'm only about 60 pages in, which is about here, but what I've read so far is really great. The innovative style that this author is talking about is the fact that we begin with Sam, who is an old man and has become the master of the mill. And then we also look back on his life as a young man who was hopeful, who, was very dismissed by his father, and he had dreams of being an engineer. He had dreams of revolutionizing their mill, but wasn't really listened to. And then now as an old man, and he lives with his daughter-in-law, and it's very interesting to see the ways that Grove so humanely writes the psychology of characters. Like, I love the scene where it talks about how his daughter-in-law did not have a very loving relationship with her husband. It was more just a marriage of convenience, and she felt no grief at losing him. But after the death of her husband, her and her father-in-law became very close, and now he's an old man, and she's thinking, to lose him would be such a sorrow in my life. And I don't feel like you ever see those relationships depicted very often in fiction, and I loved it so much. And there's so many moments where he's reflecting, even just on the page that I looked at, it's talking about how you know, his father's way of speaking to him still impacts him as an old man. And I love, it also just looks at change. It kind of talks about how so much has changed from when he's a younger man in the 1890s until now, which I think is set in the 1930s. And it's such a beautiful book. And it's also really funny. Like, I really enjoy the way that he narrates scenes. He's kind of getting Alzheimer's and is losing his memory. And it just talks about how this man comes in every day and, you know, gives him a report of the mill, and he asks every question and he asks who he is and why he's there, even though he comes in every day. And just so much of it is written very funny. Like, it reminds me a little bit of Austen in that way, like the way that, you know, he's just so cleverly writes stories and scenes. And, you know, he's not as masterful as Austen, but there's just like that element of writing characters and scenes and having a good laugh at them, but also having a deep emotional experience with them. So yes, I want to read this book. Again, I'm a slow reader and I get distracted really easily, so I read about 60 pages of this in August and I haven't picked up much of it since, but I do wish to do it again. The next book I kind of feel guilty about, and this is Emily of New Moon. I began this at a silent book club back in the spring, which was a lovely thing that my local cafe does, where we can all read a book together and drink coffee. And this is a book that came out 100 years ago in 1924, and I have been, you know, encountering Emily of New Moon for 15 years because I read Anne of Green Gables, my favorite book of all time, about 15 or 16 years ago. And as much as I want to savor Lucy Maud Montgomery because she has a limited amount of books and I have a long life ahead of me, I do kind of feel sad that her second most famous book I have not read yet. And I have been enjoying it. I'm probably, you know, I'm a fair bit into it. I don't know where my bookmark went. I'm really enjoying it. I do think that I might read Pride and Prejudice and then I might dive into this, but I also feel like I might want to dive into The Master and the Mill and then keep this for around New Year's. Like, I always visit my family, and then on about the 27th I come home and have a few days of just extra reading at the end of the year, which I really like to savor. You know, being by myself and reading is, you know, my favorite way to end the year and begin the year. I'm a huge extrovert who really, really loves people, and yet I also really love that time to reflect and think and just be stuck in that creative mind, and I do hope to end my year that way. So maybe this will be a book to end off the year, because if I do have some solid reading time, I definitely could prioritize this, but we will see. The next book is probably the newest book on this, and this is The Sounding of the Seasons, 70 Sonnets for the Christian Year. And this is really interesting. I really enjoyed that in his introduction, he talked about how over the last century or so, poetry has become deeply personal and confessional and introspective, but historically it has always been kind of more a public display and public, you know, poetry that is written on behalf of the public, and how he kind of wanted to do this again and include it in liturgies and kind of things like that. And I love it. I am on page 10, but it is very small, so that is kind of how big I am in, and I've already read the introduction as well, which is more than 10 pages. I'm enjoying it, and we're going into the month of Advent, so I'm definitely going to be trying to prioritize some of my Christian books on my shelves and kind of getting into that spirit. So I read a lot of books that speak to so many of the things that I care about, but I often don't prioritize a lot of Christian books, even though that's such a huge part of who I am. So I do want to get better at that, because why do I neglect so much of my identity and how I see the world in fiction? Talking about that, there are some Christian books that I've been neglecting. Mere Christianity is a book that I have been reading for over a year and have not finished yet. C.S. Lewis is an author that I've been reading since my childhood, so I definitely want to read more of his nonfiction. I haven't read a ton. And then Henry Nouwen is one of my favorite writers. He was a Catholic priest as well as a psychologist, and he spent the last 10 years of his life being secluded in a disability commune where he tried to live very simply and kind of understand and write. And I really love that he really highlighted the importance of valuing people with disabilities, which I love. And yeah, I read Spiritual Direction, which is probably one of my favorite books of all time. I've highlighted like 95% of it, and I've read some of his other books. I found this at a thrift store during the summer, which is called Bread for the Journey, which is just a little bit of his writing throughout the month. So I have started reading that each day, or kind of forgetting and then catching up. And then I've started 2 more of his books because why not? The first one is Turning My Mourning into Dancing, which I read the first few chapters of and was really enjoying. It's a book about trying to help others while also being deeply wounded and broken yourself. And I am enjoying that book, but I started it and then I was like, wait, I'm already in the midst of too many Henry Nouwen books. I need to put this one down and actually read some of his other books that I've started. So yes, those are some books that I definitely should prioritize, but probably will bleed into next year. The next one is a book that I'd completely forgotten about until I looked at my currently reading and went, oh yeah, that book. This one is First Test, a graphic novel, and this is a book that was originally by Tamara Pierce and then was adapted by Devin Grayson and Becca Farrow. Pierce is one of the pioneers when it comes to writing YA fantasy for females, And she wrote the Alana series in the mid-80s, which deals with a girl hiding her identity as a girl in order to become a knight. And then she followed up and read many series, all in the world of Tortall. And then when I was 19 and just beginning the channel, I read The Protector of the Small, which follows Kel, who is the first girl to openly try to become a knight. And I really liked the series. I especially liked it even more than Alana, and I thought Cal was such an amazing character, but I have not read the series in 7 years, and it's definitely a book that's not as fresh in my memory. And this adaptation is interesting. There's parts that I don't remember at all, and Farrow's art is beautiful in it. Devin Grayson, I have some mixed feelings about. She worked on the Nightwing comics in the early aughts, and she has some questionable things that she did and said, and just some of the things that I'm not super okay with. And I've also read books by her that were just very badly written. This is a book that I would like to finish, but I think that if I'm going to return to Mara Pierce, I'll probably reread either Alana or Kel's stories, or I'll go back and read more of her series that I've never read that I've heard great things about. We are coming to the end, and there's a lot of books that I could mention. A lot of them exist here, and books like Kim Ji-yeon, Born 1982, or The Edible Woman, or The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating, or Weather. These are books that have crossed over a few years now, and I have not read them. And they are books that I love. I don't know why I'm so bad at reading books that I love, but I'm not brave enough to talk about them and to rehash my failure to read these books that I love. I will talk about one of them, which I read the first 70 pages 2 years ago when I was hospitalized. I just picked up a book that I had just bought in this case, and I read the first 70 pages, and then I went back to my normal life, and I did not read it again. Are you seeing a trend in my life? And this is Whose Body, and this is by Dorothy L. Sayers. This came out in 1923, and it is the first book that follows her sleuth, who is called Lord Peter Wimsey. And the premise is that we have a gentleman who is a Jewish man who was murdered in a bath, and he is naked but his spectacles. Meanwhile, across town, there is another Jewish man who has gone missing, and they are not the same men. We have identified that the man in the bath is not the man that is missing, but we don't know who the man in the bath is. So Peter Wimsey is kind of going through, and he has some friends and stuff like that, and he's trying to endeavor it. There's definitely layers of anti-Semitism in the work, and it's hard to know which characters that Sayers kind of supports and which ones she's trying to challenge, and I think that will become more apparent near the end of the book, and I can give more further on it. But I'm hoping to read it today or tomorrow. It's not a long book. I, was already well past a quarter into it, so I'm hoping to finish it and find this mystery. Those are the books that I'm willing to talk about today that I have started in the last few years, and I'm hoping to read by the end of the year. I would love to know, which kind of reader are you? Are you a reader who picks up a book and reads straight through, who reads a couple books at a time but always finishes them? Or if you're more like me, I really love watching the podcast Books Unbound. I've been watching it for 4 or 5 years at this point, and I love listening to them talk because they're great hosts. But also Ariel reads books very similar to me, where she picks up books and then she sets them down and she forgets about them and never picks them up, and then maybe eventually picks them up. I definitely finish more books than her, but I also use audiobooks liberally, which definitely helps me do that. I kind of coined this term of a charcuterie board reader who kind of likes to pick at different things and sample them, and I relate to that so much, and I feel very seen by this. And also at the end of the year, they always give a goodbye to the books that Ariel began and did not finish. And I feel like I need that in my life, to be okay, these are books that I love. Maybe I will never finish them, and yet they are great books. And there's not something wrong with me because I can't finish books, and I'm not a real reader because I'm not finishing books. But yeah, there's some books that I sometimes forget that I haven't finished because I like them so much. I would love your perspective on books that I should prioritize and books that I should not, and all of your thoughts on the various things that I said in this video. Happy reading and writing, and I will talk to you soon. I shouldn't have moved. No, is it not going to turn on for me? There we go. There we go. Okay. My goodness. No. Normally, if I love the adaptation, I never read the book. And so often, if I love the book, I never